Now I'll call on Alexis Acevedo, another one of our students, to introduce our last speaker.
Gabriella Gutiérrez y Muhs is a poet and professor in modern languages and women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Seattle. She's first editor of Presumed Incompetent, The Intersections of Race and Class for Women in Academia, as well as single editor of various other books in Chicana criticism. She is also a main contributor in multi-genre Latinx women's anthology, Indomables. In addition, she is also co-editor of the second volume of Presumed Incompetent, Race, Class, Power, and Resistance of Women in Academia, which is known for having actively and past changed the climate in academia for people of color. She recently co-edited a poetry anthology of Latinx Chican poets that includes 66 poets and her last bilingual poetry collection, How Many Indians Can We Be? ¿Cuántos indios podemos ser?
With the time. So, okay. So I have two parts to my presentation. And the first part is with them, with us, with Elena. The moths, the dogs, Jesus, Jesús, and Miss Clairol. Gracias, Norma, por este honor. Como te dije, tienes amigos en las nubes, la tierra, las urbes, los pueblos, los barcos, los cielos. Eres de esas personas inolvidables que marcan los surcos de la vida de todos nosotros, con flores, en macetas de papel, de piel, de comida, todos hechos biblioteca. The tortilla book I have encuadernado has been made with the loose pages you have contributed to honoring, respecting, publishing others. Dr. Arturo Madrid has appeared in my life at the most unexpected times. When I received a scholarship as a 17-year-old for migrant students, and we attended a conference for my organization, he was the keynote speaker. The first man of color I saw behind the podium in the United States. A second time in LA, when my folklorico group danced for a conference, he was again keynoting at, while I was a college student at Occidental. Years later, I saw him present his work at a literary conference here in San Antonio when I was a newly minted PhD, and many times throughout my career. And now, as my mother would say, la vida es un disco, and people you admire and love like a song keep reappearing in your life. I am ever so honored to be here. Thanks to Norma and Elena Maria, to honor you, to honor them. And I really want to thank Corinne for all the help that she gives. And of course, Elvia and Elsa, they're always there. So this is an institution. When you find people with your experiences, thoughts, philosophies, bodies, reflections, misadventures, calloused hands in literature, women that, like your mother, pray the rosary while making tortillas, who have scars on their bellies that look like train tracks, you know you are not dreaming, that Shakespeare and Calderón de la Barca were wrong. No, la vida no es un sueño. Many years ago, The version of Miss Claro that appeared in the Los Angeles Times woke me up to the fact that women from fiction like Ofelia Tranquilina, queer people like Turtle, children like Cookie were not the fiction of our realities, but in fact the realities in our world of exceptions. Because Ofelia from Miss Claro had love for the world, working as a seamstress and being a single mother in Los Angeles, it gave her time to dream, dance, and even smoke. You lifted her from the list of victims we were made to become in the hands of mainstream America. Instead, Chicanx women became unfettered beings in your hands, and so did Chicanx academics. In Eve's tuck words, I would say that you have been suspending damage of our people ever since your first story appeared in print in the 70s. Little by little, making this lake of damage into a charco, something we could jump over. But what I fully understood about the invaluable imprint of Elena Maria Viramontes' literature in our American culture was when my students, mostly upper class and white in a Chicanx literature class, had a debate about whether giving Campbell's soup to your children was being a good mother or not. It was then that I knew that the Bible had an insert that was bigger than the original text. Elena Maria's work was making my students shake with ambivalence about their very small worlds. Turtle and Tranquilina, two of the four main characters of Their Dogs Came With Them, were not Ruth or Sarah from the Bible. They were more complex. They survived in a land that should have sustained their goodness, their kindness, their wholesomeness, but instead battered and raped one of them. And yet they still made soup for the poor. They were the archetypical eggs in an industrial egg beater bowl, attempting to remain unscathed in what was the improbability of a 20th and 21st century, specially designed by the American determinism assigned to people of color. No, you were not H.G. Wells, succinctly leaving people aghast with his descriptions of the English countryside folk in his negation of a god in the early 1900s, who described his family heroically disgusting. But you were equally describing our people with adjectives never used on us previously, with language not allocated to our homes and families. The fragility of the digitized version of the Chicanx soul, imagined as a commodity for those who wish to gaze upon us from one-dimensional perspectives, deconstructed, undone, pulverized by your description of a non-dream, but instead a hard-working peoples who joyously and valiantly resisted, and not only survived but thrived, soared in conditions that should have been inhuman. Elena Maria Viramontes, thank you for allowing the children of migrant farm workers like myself to read about their mothers as courageous and indomitable. Maybe some of them, Petra from Under the Feet of Jesus, perhaps mentally ill, but also able to recover from the pandemic of invisibility. A naturalism of Chicanx populations is what you evolved, and yet Émile Zola, the naturalist, André Breton, the surrealist, or even Paul Éluard and Guillaume Apollinaire, the poets I most admired as a young woman, would have become unpetrified with your literary voice. Your magical literary abracadabra would have unearthed their vision towards the rest of the world. You challenge each of them, the French naturalists, the poets, the Latin American modernists, because with your pincel, paintbrush, pardon me, your pen, you have left them wondering why they did not look at us for direction, inspiration, poetry. And yet, Chicanx critics have invalidated prison walls to direct plays based on Their Dogs Came With Them inside women's high security prisons in Arizona with your stories, like Vicky Gris has, with your novel that magically turned nature into her backdrop on that day 2 years ago when we all witnessed the precedent of women prisoners turned actresses who shone thanks to you. By us, I mean the Americans, the Mexicans, the Mexican Americans, the Chicanx people, the women who make word pozole in mole-inspired colors of nature and hard work on their backs, entire Latinx populations to represent. They would have learned to carry water on their heads, children on their backs, and entire populations on their arms to resemble our strength while navigating a chalupa along the murky waters of structural and silent biases, producing milk for the baby at their breasts made out of history, and writing a novel in their heads as Elena Maria has done against many odds and among many flowers, all beautiful and some less poisonous than others. Some exotic regenerative species, not poisonous at all. While riding into existence, a mama bear with flowers, smiling across the continent and beyond, letting people know we are beyond what Eve Talk would call suspending damage. That she and Norma Cantu have been theorizing contributions and adding colors to the palette of our representation through their writings, adding pixels to our gaze of our own selves and gigabytes to our intersectional computers, as well as putting breast milk on the table of beauty. Caribou Cafe, her story in The Moths and Other Stories. It is the short story of a woman who will defend her children from the state, the police, the war, and an entire army and country. Elena Maria has traveled through academia, and her chalupa adorned Chicanx critics have best filtered the essence of your writing, Elena Maria, by stating the following in Rebozos de Palabras, an Elena Maria Viramontes critical reader I edited. A collection I edited, an award-winning collection published in 2013. If we understand, these two quotes are by Juan May Bush. I could not quote them all, but if you're interested in Viramontes, I urge you to purchase the book. I only have 3 here, but it's a wonderful book, and I'm going to mention a few of you. This first quote, Juan May Bush. If we understand ethics and practices of freedom and self-care, we can read how Viramontes' characters in such a way that gives rise to liberation, end quote. Elena Maria Viramontes depicts an alternative notion of love, one that is associated with struggle and survival as well as with learning and transformation. Viramontes' stories demonstrate something else entirely, a form of love in which epistemological value coincides with ethical value, thereby rejoining love and liberation, end quote. Our very own Sonia Saldivar Ho, she's right here. Writes a magnificent foreword for Rebozos de Palabras, an Elena Maria Viramontes critical reader. Quote, the new direction I detected was a defining Chicana feminist literary theorists, and philosophers. Excuse me, I skipped it all. Chicana feminist literary production that elaborated the theoretical tracts being developed by feminist literary production. The collection of short stories articulated the previously silenced voices of girls, young women, and mature women, las mujeres whose unrecognized labor, quiet life work, and often not so quiet political positions as working class women in the flesh exploded into the consciousness of those of us who were reading against the grain in academic settings where these new literary productions often were not welcome or considered legitimate literature. End quote. Sonia Saldívar Hall opens the next paragraph of her intro with a quote from Elena Maria. Look at these lives. I just want you to look at this life. Sonia closes her eloquent piece with these sentences, most pertinent today. At this historical moment, when the United States once again attempts to enact virulently anti-Mexican and Latino legislation, reading Elena Maria Viramontes' literary interventions is urgent. But I'm sad, Sonia, because this is still true. And this is 8 years ago that Rebozos de Palabra came out. Although I had already read The Moths and Other Stories, a collection I recently translated for bilingual edition published by Bilingual Review, and way before Under the Feet of Jesus, the amazing novel that has not yet been studied as it should be. When I met you, Elena Maria, I knew I was before someone who was about to change the perception of many about our literature and our people. I have to thank someone who is truly responsible for most of what I have published about you, and that is one of the top 3 critics, in my opinion, of Chicana critics. Although I live a horizontal existence, I don't usually. I do have to thank Yvonne Yarbrough Bejarano, my mentor and one who taught me how to gaze upon you, Elena, our writer, with a critical, non-vertical, intersectional gaze, and how to delve into an evolving analysis of your ever-flowing and overflowing writing persona, and the person who gave us a gaze into your work with her introduction to your collection, The Moths and Other Stories. That was Yvonne. And I have a few quotes to begin my paper. That was just a pre-paper, right? That was the personal part that I wanted to thank all of you. I think we're going to have to publish it so that you can read the whole thing, because I realize, and I've been told, I actually only have like 4 minutes. Yeah, because I started at, I have 5 minutes. So I'm going to read part of this paper. I'm going to skip a lot of parts so it might feel disjointed. But before I do that, I want to read the poem because I don't want to skip the poem. I wrote a poem for this. I am a poet. Miracles. They call the metal body parts you hang on saints' gowns miracles. They thank saints for the miracles that saved their loved ones from a heart attack, un corazón, the loss of vision, un ojo, the baby who lived, a small open-armed pin, to be put as a miracle, a leg milagro, for the trucker who might have lost his leg but didn't, a hand, una mano, for him whose hand was caught in a machine. But there is no image for you gathering back your soul. What would signify soul? The true miracle They don't know that we can still smile, that we weren't killed and our children grew up in our families, not in a foster home. The invisibilized see miracles in every car they drive, every meal together, every day a bed, every night warm, every friend loyalty, every book knowledge, every vegetable, every child, every bicycle, every unimprisoned thought. The miracle is that we have turned out to be our grandmother's blessings. There should be book milagros with your name. Elena Maria, Norma, Arturo, Antonia, Sonia, Mary Pat. And I'll read a couple of parts from my paper. I wanted to I'm gonna skip some things. I'm gonna skip the Lorna D. Cervantes and the León Portilla poems. Yeah, but I started 2 more minutes. Oh gosh, so much pressure. I'll just read the end of my paper. My paper is 23 pages long. So. The men and women we see are the underdogs of a society that rarely notices them. Quote, Amma looked so tired. The soft, fleshy lips that once appeared in her wedding photograph were now chafed slits where she inhaled her cigarettes. The whites of her eyes were pinkish, as if the pain flooded even the smallest veins. End quote. They have the ability to become the puppets of society. These characters, several children, spill over their tight clothes and shoes as they grow, their growth a liability since they are imprisoned by them, as is the case of Turtle. Once again, in Viramontes' kneading pen, and through her characters, women become unfettered hands, the heroines who produce and revive babies against the hostile nature betrothed to them by society. I have a quote about that. The evolution of the Chicano body through Viramontes' oeuvre is exemplary. In Their Dogs Came With Them, she expands the variability of representation in Chicano literature. The reader becomes acquainted with the urban Chicano Latino characters, still through a social class lens, nonetheless encompassing previously unexposed, non-delineated subjectivities, such as the biracial Protestant, androgynous, and Vietnam bodies. These unveiled bodies of the Chicanx community are all depicted and presented to us in a portrait of society that Viramontes makes visible. Her characters are reformulated for the reader to decipher. Through them, as well as personified fluctuations of 60s and 70s East Los Angeles urban landscape, Elena Maria Viramontes responds to the society from which she hailed. The experiences of struggle are fleshed out through characters both strong and weak, comprising a dynamic narrative of social and physical experience. Thank you.